I'm president of the National Association of Scholars and interested in your past partly as president of Connecticut College.
Thank you.
There's a component to your book, the dominant component, which is a pitch for the continuing importance of generosity and the threats that come from pretty much outside, the things that are undercutting the motives to be generous in this particular philanthropic way. I was wondering if you had something to say about the threat within the philanthropic community, and by that I'm referring back to what goes on in higher education a lot. We've had numerous instances of donors who have found their funds misspent or spent in a fashion that they did not intend. There's famous instances of foundations that have sunsetted themselves because they're afraid of being captured by the professional fund givers who want to nudge the organizations towards purposes that the founders didn't intend. And there is this broad problem of those, both individuals and foundations that want to give, finding that the spirit of philanthropy somehow gets corrupted or gets undercut or gets channeled away from the purposes that people intended. That would seem to me to be one of the things which those of us who both depend on philanthropy, as I do, but all those of us who care about philanthropy as a basic dynamic of American society would want to worry about. What do we do to make this spirit of freedom really thrive and not have philanthropy become a kind of vortex that centers around the purpose of the professional fund givers?
Right. Thank you very much, Peter. It is easy for people who have a focus on running an organization to want the money to come in like this instead of perhaps like this and fulfill something that a donor has in mind. And it certainly has happened that kind of transformation happens over time and over different administrations. I think for the most part, academic institutions try very hard to fulfill donor intent. Sometimes the donors can't possibly intend what's needed 50 years later because, it didn't exist. And so within the best framework they can, a president will decide. We had a scholarship at Connecticut College that was designated for a Methodist female from southwestern Kentucky.
You couldn't find one?
Let me just tell you how hard. She had to be needy. She had to be needy and good enough to get in. And my poor admissions office would say to me, we just can't spend any more money looking for her. This year, we're not going to spend it. And we actually acquired quite a substantial endowment there that wasn't being used when I was turning away people whom that family would have loved, but they weren't from right there, or they weren't Christian. They were something else. So you get my drift. Now, there are times when you go back to a family, and we all know this, but mainly, is there good intent in most academic institutions? I think mostly. There are notorious cases where a donor, like the Basses went back to Yale and said, this isn't working the way we wanted. But for the most part, I think when you think of the billions of dollars that get transferred to higher education, I think I'm relatively proud of our profile and of achievement. On the other hand, donor intent is very complicated. Maintaining it over time is very complicated. And I think part of what I wish higher education would do would be to teach philanthropy to undergraduates. It's a great interdisciplinary field. You do history, you do philosophy, you do finance, and therefore mathematics, you do economics. And just as we have Latin American studies and we have early Roman studies and all, why not philanthropic studies? Part of what we need to do is offer courses and at least minors in this field so that people become familiar with donor intent and with how philanthropy has changed our country and how we have become who we are because of the power of philanthropy. Here, people who never would have had a gnat's eyelash of a chance get to be major contributors because somebody invested in them. And many of those people are as Shal said, our faculty, our students, our graduate students, and many of the people at the National Association of Scholars. So we have to keep that going. And part of the work I'd love to see the association do is to begin to press for philanthropic studies in premier and all kinds of higher education institutions.
You know, there's a big debate, ongoing debate about American exceptionalism among the historians and the political philosophers, but I especially after reading your book, I think that to the degree that domestically we can be called exceptionalist, it's rooted in our system of philanthropy.
Right.
It's that is that if you there are few places where you go to a philanthropist to try something new. You usually go to you go to some official.
Right.
And I mean, would you agree with that? That in
Yes.
other words, that you could argue that we're not you could argue the question of American exceptionalism generally, but on this specific issue of philanthropy, to the degree that it feels different here, I think a lot of it is rooted in the distinctive philanthropic tradition
That's
that
right.
is just separate from the way other countries have organized themselves.
That's right. And that's part of what we have to be sure gets brought to the next and following generations. When we say American exceptionalism, we don't have to mean that we are best in everything, because statistically that's just not true. But we are profoundly different
In this
in
respect.
the way
Yes.
citizens engage with each other.
Which has drawbacks and assets, but it's different. Yeah.
Right, and that emerges from the three items that I mentioned right in the beginning. That is our optimism, our idealism, and our entrepreneurism. And they're all deeply connected. They are very powerfully what makes our commercial sector so successful. We tried all kinds of things that no one had thought of before, and they end up transforming a field, right? And then creating a market. And on the nonprofit side, we have that same energy that creates all kinds of possibilities. And innovation is a connection to the future that is very much powered by philanthropy. And that makes us exceptional. That's why people all over the world want their children to be raised here. They feel as though they'll have a different kind of opportunity, and that's true. And if you look at nations across the world that have invested in boys and girls and see which ones of them have actually contributed to the well-being of the largest proportion of their citizens, the ones who've invested in both. The ones who've just invested in their male children are not doing as well. And the way females got to go to school was not because the government said, let's start schools for girls. Philanthropists said, we'll start schools for young ladies. And we'll start universities and colleges for young ladies. And suddenly it was for both young ladies and young men. And then more recently, imagine the crazy idea that graduates of elite institutions would be funded to go back and teach in low-income schools. What a crazy idea. Only Americans. Nowhere else would that have flown. You'd have to have the idea, an undergraduate has an idea like that, like Wendy Kopp did, and then she got investors. I mean, that's truly an only in America idea. And if you just decided to take one day a week and notice the only in America things you came in touch with, the people you realized when they tell you where they came from and how they got here and how they got to be, you'd say, only in America. That's what we have to be sure is free, to run hard and to run better, because there are lots of improvements that need to be made in the philanthropic world, as we've mentioned. You have one more.
Thank you, Claire Gaudiani. Thank each of you for coming out this evening and being a part of the conversation, and we'll see you next time.